The sirens pierced through the morning calm like screaming banshees, their wails bouncing off the red brick walls of Maplewood Elementary. Black tactical vehicles surrounded the building, their engines rumbling with predatory intensity. Through classroom windows, small faces pressed against glass, eyes wide with terror as SWAT officers in full combat gear crouched behind car doors. Assault rifles trained on the main entrance. Inside room 204, 7-year-old Emma clutched her teddy bear to her chest, tears streaming down her cheeks as she huddled beneath her desk, alongside 22 other second graders. The fluorescent lights had been switched off, casting long shadows across the alphabet carpet where they'd been learning about vowels just minutes before. Their teacher, Mrs. Rodriguez, pressed her finger to her lips, her own hands trembling as she spoke in barely audible whispers. "Stay quiet, angels. Everything will be okay." But nothing felt okay. The air conditioning had been shut off, leaving the room thick with the scent of fear and small bodies pressed too close together. Outside, radio static crackled through bullhorns, and heavy boots thundered across the hallway linoleum. Emma couldn't understand why the police were here, why they'd been told to hide, why her stomach felt like it was full of jumping grasshoppers. 3 hours earlier, the day had begun like any other Tuesday at Maplewood Elementary. The school buses had arrived in their usual procession, disgorging streams of children with backpacks bouncing against their shoulders. The crossing guard, Mrs. Chen, waved them across Elm Street with her familiar smile, her orange vest bright against the autumn morning. Teachers sipped coffee in the faculty lounge, discussing lesson plans and weekend adventures. Among the arrivals was 12-year-old Marcus Thompson, a sixth grader, starting his third week at his new school. His family had moved to Maplewood from across town after his father's job transfer, leaving behind the familiar routines and understanding teachers at his previous school. Marcus walked with measured steps, his dark blue noise-canceling headphones secured over his ears, the soft hum of white noise helping to filter out the overwhelming cacophony of school buses, chattering children, and morning traffic. The headphones were Marcus's lifeline, a carefully chosen tool that helped him navigate a world that often felt too loud, too bright, too chaotic. They were prescribed by his occupational therapist, Dr. Jennifer Walsh, who had worked with Marcus and his mother, Sarah, to develop coping strategies for his autism spectrum disorder. The sleek device looked like any teenager's headphones, but inside, sophisticated sound processing technology helped regulate the sensory input that could otherwise trigger overwhelming anxiety or meltdowns. Marcus adjusted his backpack straps and took a deep breath, preparing himself for another day of navigating new hallways, new faces, new routines. He'd already mapped out the quietest routes to his classes, identified the bathroom stalls with the least foot traffic, and memorized his teachers' names and classroom numbers. Organization and predictability were his anchors in the storm of social interaction that school demanded. Sarah had spent hours the night before reviewing his schedule with him, practicing conversations he might need to have, reminding him of the coping strategies they'd developed together. She'd also sent detailed information to his teachers about his needs, explaining how the headphones helped him focus and function in the classroom environment. But Sarah hadn't anticipated Karen Hendricks. Karen stood near the school's main entrance, clipboard in hand, her perfectly styled blonde hair shellacked into place despite the morning breeze. As the newly appointed safety volunteer for the Parent-Teacher Association, she'd assigned herself the unofficial role of monitoring the school grounds for anything that seemed out of place. At 43, Karen had built her identity around being the neighborhood's unofficial authority on everything from property values to proper lawn maintenance. Her piercing blue eyes scanned the arriving students with the intensity of a security guard, cataloging backpack sizes, noting unfamiliar faces, and mentally filing away anything that struck her as unusual. Karen prided herself on her attention to detail, her ability to spot potential problems before they became actual problems. In her mind, vigilance was a civic duty, and she wore her self-appointed responsibility like a badge of honor. When Marcus walked past her post near the flagpole, Karen's gaze locked onto his headphones with laser focus. She'd never seen him before, which was unusual since she made it her business to know every family in the school district. The device on his head looked sophisticated, expensive, with LED indicators that pulsed gently blue. To Karen's suspicious mind, trained by years of consuming sensationalized news stories about school threats, the headphones didn't look like a simple music player. "Excuse me, young man," she called out, her voice sharp enough to cut through the morning chatter. Marcus stopped walking, but didn't turn around immediately. Social interactions with strangers were challenging for him, and Karen's tone triggered his anxiety response. His therapist had taught him to take deep breaths and count to 5 before responding to unexpected social demands. "I'm talking to you. Turn around." When Marcus finally faced her, Karen noted his delayed response time. The way his eyes didn't quite meet hers. The slight rocking motion he'd developed as a self-soothing behavior. To someone untrained in recognizing autism spectrum behaviors, Marcus's responses could seem evasive, suspicious. "What's that device on your head?" Karen demanded, pointing at his headphones with her pen. Marcus touched his headphones reflexively, a gesture that Karen interpreted as protective, defensive. "They're headphones, for noise." His answer was truthful, but brief, which was typical for Marcus when feeling stressed. Extended explanations were difficult for him, particularly when confronting an authority figure who seemed hostile. The morning routine disruption was already throwing off his carefully structured mental schedule. "Noise. What kind of noise? Where did you get them?" Karen stepped closer, her voice rising with each question. Other parents were beginning to stare, creating the kind of attention that Marcus desperately wanted to avoid. His hands began to flap slightly at his sides. Another self-soothing behavior that his family understood, but that looked strange to unfamiliar observers. "I have to go to class," Marcus mumbled, turning away from Karen's interrogation. But Karen wasn't finished. She grabbed his arm, her manicured nails digging into his sleeve. Physical touch from strangers was particularly overwhelming for Marcus, triggering his fight-or-flight response. He pulled away sharply, a reaction that Karen interpreted as aggressive resistance. "Don't walk away from me when I'm talking to you. I need to see some identification." The word identification sent alarm bells through Marcus's anxiety-flooded brain. He'd been taught to cooperate with school officials, but Karen wasn't wearing a staff badge or uniform. Her demands felt arbitrary, frightening. His breathing became shallow. His hands flapped more noticeably, and he began to rock from foot to foot. "I don't have ID. I'm a student. I have to go." Karen's suspicions crystallized into certainty. The boy's evasive answers, his strange behaviors, the sophisticated electronic device, his refusal to provide identification, everything pointed to potential danger. In her mind, she wasn't witnessing an autistic child having an anxiety response to unexpected confrontation. She was seeing a threat that needed immediate intervention. "Stay right there. Don't move." Karen pulled out her cell phone and dialed 911 with the dramatic flair of someone who believed she was saving lives. Her voice took on the breathless urgency of a television news reporter breaking a major story. "I need police at Maplewood Elementary immediately. There's a suspicious individual on the school grounds with some kind of electronic device. He's acting very strange, won't identify himself, and appears to be conducting surveillance. He could be dangerous. The 911 operator, trained to take all school-related threats seriously in the post-Columbine era, immediately dispatched units to the scene. Within minutes, the first police cruisers arrived, their red and blue lights painting the morning sky in emergency colors. What had begun as a routine school day was about to become a community crisis. Marcus, overwhelmed by the growing crowd and the approaching sirens, did what his therapist had taught him to do in overwhelming situations. He found a quiet space. Unfortunately, that quiet space was behind the school's maintenance shed, where he sat on the ground with his back against the brick wall, his headphones providing the white noise that helped regulate his overstimulated nervous system. To the arriving officers, however, Marcus looked like someone hiding. His location behind the building, combined with Karen's breathless report of suspicious behavior and an electronic device, triggered every protocol designed to respond to potential school threats. Within 30 minutes, the situation had escalated from a simple misunderstanding to a full-scale lockdown. The SWAT team commander, Lieutenant Rodriguez, studied the situation through his binoculars. A young black male behind the building, wearing what appeared to be sophisticated electronic equipment, exhibiting what witnesses described as erratic behavior. In the heightened security environment surrounding schools, every detail seemed to confirm the potential threat assessment. All units, we have a possible code red situation. Suspect is isolated behind the east wing, implementing full lockdown protocols. Inside the school, Principal Morrison's voice crackled over the intercom system with barely controlled panic. Teachers and students, we are implementing lockdown procedures immediately. Move away from windows, turn off lights, and remain silent until further notice. The practiced lockdown drill that students had rehearsed monthly suddenly became terrifyingly real. Children who had giggled during practice sessions now trembled beneath desks, their young minds unable to process why their safe space had become a danger zone. Teachers locked classroom doors with shaking hands, their training kicking in even as their hearts hammered against their ribs. Mrs. Rodriguez pressed her back against her locked classroom door, trying to project calm for her second graders, while her own mind raced with worst-case scenarios. She could hear boots in the hallway, radio chatter, the mechanical sounds of tactical equipment being deployed. Through her window, she watched helicopters circle overhead, their rotors chopping the air with ominous intensity. Meanwhile, Marcus remained seated behind the maintenance shed, unaware that he was the center of the crisis swirling around him. His headphones blocked out the sirens, the shouted commands, the helicopter rotors. The white noise that usually helped him cope with sensory overload was now preventing him from understanding that dozens of armed officers were surrounding his position. He pulled out his math homework, determined to use the unexpected quiet time productively. Numbers had always made sense to Marcus in ways that social situations didn't. Mathematical equations followed logical patterns, had predictable outcomes, provided the structure and certainty that his mind craved. As chaos erupted around him, Marcus solved algebraic problems with focused concentration. Lieutenant Rodriguez studied the suspect through his scope, noting what appeared to be paperwork in the young man's hands. Could be plans, blueprints, target lists, he muttered to his communications officer. We need to neutralize this situation before it escalates. The tactical team moved into position with military precision, their training focused on rapid resolution of active shooter scenarios. They'd responded to 3 false alarms this month alone, but they couldn't afford to assume this was another drill gone wrong. The stakes were too high. The potential consequences too devastating. Inside the school, the lockdown stretched into its second hour. Small children wet themselves rather than risk asking to use the bathroom. Teachers tried to keep their classes calm with whispered stories and silent games. But the weight of uncertainty pressed down on everyone like a suffocating blanket. Parents gathered outside the police perimeter, some weeping, others demanding information, all united in their terror for their children's safety. Sarah Thompson was among those parents, having received the automated emergency call while at her office downtown. She'd broken multiple traffic laws racing to the school, her mind spinning with possibilities too horrible to consider. But as she listened to the police briefings and witness statements, a terrible suspicion began to form in her chest. The suspect is described as a young black male wearing headphones. The police information officer announced to the crowd of parents. He was observed exhibiting suspicious behavior and carrying electronic equipment. Sarah's blood turned to ice water. Marcus wore headphones. Marcus was new to the school. Marcus sometimes behaved in ways that unfamiliar people found strange or confusing. She pushed through the crowd of parents, desperate to reach the police command post. "Officer, I think there's been a mistake. My son Marcus is autistic. He wears noise-canceling headphones to help with sensory processing. He's not dangerous. He's just different." The desk sergeant looked at her with practiced skepticism. Every crisis produced parents claiming their child was innocent, misunderstood, wrongfully accused. "Ma'am, we have multiple witnesses reporting suspicious behavior. We need to treat this situation with appropriate caution." "But you don't understand. His headphones are medical equipment. He has autism spectrum disorder. This is probably just a terrible misunderstanding." Sarah's pleas fell on ears conditioned by training that prioritized caution over compassion, procedure over individual circumstances. The machine of emergency response had been set in motion, and it would run its course regardless of her increasingly frantic explanations. At 11:47 a.m., exactly 3 hours after Karen's initial 911 call, the tactical team decided to make their move. Lieutenant Rodriguez gave the signal, and 6 officers approached Marcus's position from multiple angles, their weapons drawn but pointed skyward, their movements choreographed through countless training scenarios. "Hands where we can see them. Drop the device. Get on the ground now." Marcus looked up from his math homework in confusion, his noise-canceling headphones having muffled most of the shouted commands. What he saw was terrifying. Armed figures in black tactical gear surrounding him, their faces hidden behind shields and helmets. His autism made it difficult to process multiple stimuli simultaneously, and the overwhelming sensory input triggered a complete shutdown. He couldn't speak, couldn't move, couldn't understand what they wanted from him. His body went rigid with terror, his hands frozen around his pencil and homework sheet. To the officers, his lack of compliance looked like resistance, defiance, potential aggression. "Subject is non-responsive. Repeat, subject is non-responsive to commands." One officer approached cautiously. His training focused on disarming potentially dangerous individuals. When he reached for Marcus's headphones, the suspicious device that had triggered the entire crisis, Marcus instinctively pulled away, protecting the equipment that helped him function in an overwhelming world. This protective gesture was misinterpreted as an attempt to activate a device, possibly a detonator. The officer grabbed Marcus's wrists, forcing him face down onto the concrete behind the maintenance shed. The rough handling triggered a meltdown, causing Marcus to cry out and struggle against the restraints. "I want my mom. Please. I want my mom." His distressed cries carried across the school grounds, reaching Sarah's ears through the crowd of parents pressed against the police barriers. She recognized her son's voice immediately, the particular tone he used when overwhelmed and frightened. Her maternal instincts overrode all consideration for protocol or personal safety. "That's my son. Let me go to him. He needs me." Sarah broke through the police line, security officers grabbing her arms as she fought to reach Marcus. Her screams joined his, creating a cacophony of anguish that cut through the tactical radio chatter and official procedures. It was then that Janet Morrison, Maplewood Elementary's principal, arrived at the command post with Marcus's educational files, his individualized education plan, and his medical documentation. She'd spent the lockdown hours searching through records, trying to understand how one of her students had become the center of a terrorist threat response. "Stop. You need to stop right now," she shouted at the officers restraining Marcus. "This child has autism spectrum disorder. Those headphones are prescribed medical equipment. He's not a threat. He's a student having a sensory overload response." Principal Morrison thrust the documentation at Lieutenant Rodriguez, her voice carrying the authority of 20 years in education and the fury of an administrator watching her student being traumatized by adult ignorance. "Read it. Read his IEP. Read his medical records. This is Marcus Thompson, a 6th grade student with special needs." Lieutenant Rodriguez studied the paperwork with growing recognition of the catastrophic mistake his team had made. The sophisticated electronic device was indeed medical equipment, prescribed by a licensed occupational therapist. The suspicious behavior was typical autism spectrum responses to unexpected social interaction. The evasive answers were the communication patterns of a neurodivergent child trying to navigate an overwhelming situation. The dangerous individual conducting surveillance was a 12-year-old boy doing homework behind a building because he needed quiet space to calm his overstimulated nervous system. "All units, stand down. Repeat. All units, stand down immediately." The tactical team released Marcus, who immediately curled into a fetal position, his body shaking with the aftershocks of sensory overwhelm and trauma. Sarah finally reached her son, gathering him into her arms as he sobbed against her shoulder, his headphones askew but still functioning, still providing the white noise that helped regulate his overwhelmed nervous system. "It's okay, baby. Mommy's here. You're safe now. Everything's going to be okay." But everything wasn't okay. The damage had been done, not just to Marcus, but to the entire school community. 700 children had spent 3 hours in terror, believing their school was under attack. Teachers had aged years in a single morning, their sense of safety and normalcy shattered. Parents had confronted their deepest fears, imagining their children's deaths while standing helplessly behind police barriers. As the lockdown was lifted and the tactical vehicles withdrew, the community began to understand the magnitude of what had occurred. An innocent child's medical needs had been weaponized by ignorance and prejudice, transforming a school day into a nightmare that would haunt everyone involved for years to come. The aftermath unfolded over several weeks, during which the true scope of the crisis became apparent. Marcus was hospitalized for severe anxiety and trauma responses. His progress in adapting to his new school completely derailed. Sarah took indefinite leave from her job to provide round-the-clock support for her son, whose trust in the adult world had been shattered by the morning's events. The school district faced potential lawsuits from dozens of families whose children had been traumatized by the lockdown. Teachers reported symptoms of post-traumatic stress, struggling to maintain normalcy in classrooms where their students jumped at every unexpected sound. The community's faith in its institutions, its schools, its police, its safety procedures, lay in ruins. But, perhaps most importantly, questions began to emerge about how the crisis had started. Who had made the initial 911 call? What had they reported? Why had a routine school morning escalated into a tactical response to a non-existent threat? The answers to these questions would be revealed at an emergency school board meeting 3 weeks after the lockdown. A meeting that would expose the ugly truth beneath the community's facade of tolerance and inclusion. The Maplewood Elementary Auditorium had never seen anything like the crowd that gathered on that October evening, their faces reflecting anger, confusion, and a demand for accountability that could no longer be ignored. Dr. Patricia Williams, the school district superintendent, stood behind the podium with the weight of institutional failure pressing down on her shoulders. She'd spent 3 weeks reviewing security footage, interviewing witnesses, and consulting with legal experts to understand how her district had become the center of a national conversation about discrimination, disability rights, and the school-to-prison pipeline. Ladies and gentlemen, we're here tonight to address the events of October 15th and to ensure that such a tragedy never occurs again in our district. We've completed our investigation, and I want to share our findings with complete transparency. The auditorium fell silent, hundreds of community members leaning forward to hear the explanation they'd been demanding since their children came home, traumatized from what should have been an ordinary school day. The lockdown was triggered by a 911 call placed at 8:23 a.m. by a parent volunteer who reported suspicious activity on school grounds. The caller identified a student's medical equipment as a potential threat and described normal autism spectrum behaviors as dangerous or evasive. Dr. Williams paused, letting the implications sink in before continuing. The student in question, Marcus Thompson, was using noise-canceling headphones prescribed by his occupational therapist to help manage sensory processing challenges associated with autism spectrum disorder. At no point was he engaged in any threatening or dangerous behavior. A murmur ran through the crowd as parents began to understand the scope of the mistake. Their children had been terrorized not because of an actual threat, but because someone had misunderstood and reported a disabled child's accommodation as suspicious. Furthermore, our investigation revealed that proper procedures were not followed in handling the initial report. The caller's description of the student's behavior reflected bias and ignorance about autism spectrum disorders. Yet these descriptions were treated as credible threat assessment without verification or consultation with school personnel familiar with the student. Sarah Thompson sat in the front row, holding Marcus's hand as he fidgeted with his headphones, the very device that had nearly destroyed their lives. She'd spent weeks deciding whether to attend this meeting, whether to subject Marcus to more public attention, whether her family could endure another confrontation with the ignorance that had already caused them so much pain. But Marcus had insisted on coming. In the weeks since the lockdown, he'd become an unlikely advocate for autism awareness, his traumatic experience transforming into a determination to educate others about neurodiversity. Despite his communication challenges, he'd found his voice in the aftermath of injustice. Dr. Williams continued her presentation, detailing the failures in communication, training, and policy that had allowed the crisis to escalate. But the community wasn't interested in bureaucratic explanations. They wanted to know who had made the call, whose ignorance and prejudice had terrorized their children and shattered their sense of safety. Board member Jennifer Hayes finally asked the question everyone was thinking. Dr. Williams, can you identify the individual who made the initial 911 call? The community has a right to know who was responsible for this crisis. Dr. Williams exchanged glances with the district's legal counsel before responding. The call was placed by Karen Hendricks, a parent volunteer who had been assigned unofficial monitoring duties by the PTA Safety Committee. The name hit the auditorium like a physical blow. Karen Hendricks was well known in the community, notorious for her complaints about property maintenance, her confrontational presence at community meetings, and her tendency to appoint herself as an authority on neighborhood standards. But even those familiar with Karen's abrasive personality were stunned by the scope of the damage her actions had caused. Karen herself sat in the back of the auditorium, her face flushed with defensive anger as hundreds of eyes turned in her direction. She'd spent 3 weeks crafting justifications for her actions, convincing herself that she'd acted appropriately, that the real problem was everyone else's failure to appreciate her vigilance and community service. Board Chair Michael Chen asked the inevitable follow-up question. Is Mrs. Hendricks present tonight? We'd like to give her an opportunity to address the community and explain her actions. All eyes focused on Karen as she stood slowly, her chin raised in defiance despite the hostile atmosphere surrounding her. She'd built her identity around being right, being important, being the voice of reason in a chaotic world. Admitting error would require dismantling the entire foundation of her self-image. I did what any concerned parent would do when they saw something suspicious, Karen announced, her voice carrying across the silent auditorium. I saw a young man with an electronic device behaving strangely, and I reported it to the authorities. I make no apologies for putting children's safety first. Her words triggered an immediate response from the crowd. Parents who'd spent hours in terror, teachers who'd barricaded themselves with their students, community members who'd watched SWAT teams surround their elementary school, all began shouting their outrage at Karen's complete lack of remorse or recognition of the harm she'd caused. You terrorized our children. That was a special needs student. You destroyed this community's sense of safety. Dr. Williams called for order. But the crowd's anger couldn't be contained by parliamentary procedure. 3 weeks of trauma, confusion, and unanswered questions had created a pressure cooker of community rage that Karen's defiant non-apology had just brought to full boil. Marcus stood up slowly, his movement cutting through the chaos like a knife through paper. The auditorium gradually fell silent as the 12-year-old who'd been at the center of the crisis prepared to speak. His mother squeezed his hand encouragingly, knowing how difficult public speaking was for him, how much courage it took for him to address a crowd of hundreds. Mrs. Hendricks, Marcus said, his young voice carrying clearly through the sound system. My headphones help me hear better, not worse. They make the world quieter so I can think. You scared me that day. You scared everybody. I just wanted to go to school like other kids. His simple words, delivered with the honesty that only a child could provide, revealed the profound human cost of Karen's actions in ways that no administrative report ever could. This wasn't about policies or procedures or liability. It was about a young person's right to access education without being treated as a threat because of his disability. Karen's face flushed deeper as she realized the full weight of community condemnation focused on her actions. But instead of acknowledging her mistake, instead of offering the apology that might have begun healing the damage she'd caused, she doubled down on her defensive justifications. I couldn't have known about his condition. He looked suspicious. Anyone would have done the same thing in my position. The auditorium erupted again, but this time the anger was more focused, more purposeful. Parent after parent stood to address Karen directly, their voices shaking with controlled fury as they described the terror their children had experienced, the sleepless nights, the therapy sessions, the way their trust in their school's safety had been shattered by her ignorance and prejudice. Maria Santos, whose first-grade daughter had wet herself hiding under her desk, spoke through tears. My daughter still wakes up screaming at night. She's afraid to go to school. She asks me every morning if the bad men with guns are coming back. That's what your vigilance did to my baby." Robert Kim, a teacher who'd spent 3 hours barricaded with his third-grade class, stood with his voice breaking. "I've been teaching for 15 years. I've never seen children so terrified. They trusted me to keep them safe. And instead, I had to tell them to hide under desks because someone decided a disabled student's medical equipment was a threat." One by one, community members shared their stories of trauma, their accounts of the damage Karen's call had inflicted on an entire generation of children who would now associate school with fear, lockdowns, and armed tactical teams. The cumulative weight of their testimonies created an irrefutable record of the human cost of prejudice and ignorance. Through it all, Karen stood rigidly defensive, her face growing redder with each accusation, her justifications becoming more elaborate and desperate. She spoke of community safety, of the difficult decisions that concerned citizens had to make, of the impossibility of knowing every child's medical needs. But her words rang hollow against the overwhelming evidence of the pain she'd caused. Dr. Williams finally restored order by announcing the district's response to the crisis. Based on our investigation and community input, the school board has voted to implement comprehensive reforms to prevent such incidents in the future. The reforms were extensive mandatory disability awareness training for all staff and volunteers, revised security protocols that required consultation with school personnel before external emergency responses, the creation of a student accessibility advocate position, and the establishment of a community education program about neurodiversity and inclusion. But the community wanted more than policy changes. They wanted accountability for the individual whose ignorance had created the crisis. Board member Jennifer Hayes addressed this demand directly. The board has also voted to permanently remove Karen Hendricks from all volunteer positions within the district. She will no longer be permitted on school grounds, except as necessary for her own children's essential school functions, and she will be required to complete sensitivity training before any such access is granted. The announcement was met with applause, but Karen's response revealed the depth of her refusal to accept responsibility for her actions. "This is ridiculous. You're punishing me for trying to protect children. I was doing my civic duty." Her outburst was met with a wall of silence that spoke volumes about the community's judgment of her actions and her continued refusal to acknowledge the harm she'd caused. In that moment, Karen became completely isolated, her bridges burned by her stubborn refusal to admit error or show remorse. The meeting concluded with Sarah Thompson addressing the community, her voice strong with the authority of a mother who'd watched her child be traumatized by adult ignorance and prejudice. What happened to Marcus could happen to any child who's different, who needs accommodations, who doesn't fit narrow definitions of normal. This crisis didn't start with police protocols or emergency procedures. It started with one person's decision to see difference as danger, accommodation as threat, neurodiversity as something to be feared rather than understood. She looked directly at Karen as she continued. "My son forgives you, Mrs. Hendricks, even if you can't forgive yourself enough to apologize. But forgiveness doesn't mean forgetting. It doesn't mean pretending that ignorance is acceptable when it traumatizes children. It means learning from mistakes and doing better in the future." In the weeks following the school board meeting, the community began the long process of healing and reform. Marcus gradually returned to school, supported by teachers who now understood his needs and classmates who'd been educated about autism spectrum disorders. His headphones were no longer seen as suspicious equipment, but as an essential accommodation that helped him succeed in the educational environment. The lockdown drills that had once seemed routine took on new significance as educators worked to help students process their trauma while maintaining necessary safety procedures. Counseling services were expanded, teacher training was enhanced, and the entire district underwent a cultural shift toward greater awareness and inclusion of neurodivergent students. Karen Hendricks, meanwhile, became a cautionary tale about the dangers of unchecked prejudice and the importance of education over assumption. Her refusal to acknowledge responsibility or show remorse had cost her not just her volunteer positions, but her standing in the community she'd claimed to serve. Property values in her neighborhood actually increased slightly after her removal from various community positions, as residents appreciated the reduction in complaints and confrontations. The broader impact of the crisis extended far beyond Maplewood Elementary. The incident became a case study in disability rights organizations, a training scenario for law enforcement agencies, and a powerful example of how quickly misunderstanding can escalate into community trauma. Marcus's story was shared at conferences and workshops, helping educate others about autism spectrum disorders and the importance of inclusive communities. 6 months after the lockdown, Marcus participated in the district's first annual Neurodiversity Awareness Day, speaking to an assembly of students, teachers, and parents about his experiences and the importance of understanding difference rather than fearing it. His headphones, once seen as a threat, became a symbol of accommodation and inclusion. Being different isn't scary, Marcus told the audience, his confidence grown through months of advocacy and support. Being afraid of differences, that's what's scary. My headphones help me learn just like glasses help some people see better. We all need different things to do our best. The audience's standing ovation reflected not just appreciation for Marcus's courage, but the community's commitment to never again allow ignorance and prejudice to terrorize their children. The healing process would continue for years, but the foundation had been laid for a more inclusive, understanding community that valued neurodiversity as a strength rather than a threat. As for Karen Hendricks, she eventually left Maplewood altogether, relocating to a different district where her reputation hadn't preceded her. But the lessons of her actions remained, a permanent reminder to the community of the importance of education, empathy, and the courage to admit mistakes when they occur. The story of Marcus Thompson and the Maplewood lockdown became more than just a local crisis. It became a turning point, a moment when a community chose learning over fear, inclusion over prejudice, and growth over defensiveness. The headphones that had once triggered a SWAT response became a symbol of hope, accommodation, and the beautiful diversity that makes every community stronger when its members are understood, accepted, and celebrated for exactly who they are. In the end, the crisis that had begun with fear and misunderstanding concluded with education and hope, proving that even the darkest moments can become catalysts for positive change when communities choose compassion over prejudice, learning over judgment, and love over fear.